Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. We are so excited that you're joining us here for Astronomy Days today. We are really excited about our presentation. And while we're waiting for everybody to get settled, I have an icebreaker question for you. How many different types of rockets do you think are available today? So while you're putting your answers in the chat, I'm going to go through a quick tutorial for Zoom. So we will have live captions for this program. So if you'd like to use the captions at the bottom of your screen, click Closed Captions and then click Show Subtitle. The subtitles are going to look like that and will be at the bottom of your screen. Then if our videos are over the slide, that's no good. That blocks your view. So go up to the top of the screen and click View Options and then choose Side-by-Side mode. That allows the videos to be off to the side, and then you get a perfect view of the presentation. Lastly, please talk to us in the chat. We love to hear from you. Ask your questions, make your comments, but please keep it on topic, and please be kind and respectful to everyone. With that, I'm going to stop sharing and we'll see what people are guessing. I'm not sure what my guess would be. 4? Tony's gonna tell us the right answer. Sean says 100, Jasper 10, Carol 40 to 60, 5, a lot 65, 20, 30, 50. 1,534. Now that is a very specific answer. So Tony, what's the right answer?
Well, we're gonna see. I'm gonna show you a couple of graphics that give you the answer. I don't have the exact answer off the top of my head, and that's kind of the point. We're gonna get into it here and learn how to pick the right rocket.
Well, let me officially introduce you. Before I do that, Cindy, if you don't mind assigning CCs to Melanie. So Tony Rice is a NASA JPL Solar System Ambassador, and he has been working with us forever on Astronomy Days and all of our astronomy programming at the museum, as long as I've been there. So Tony has been just a fantastic part of our event. So Tony, welcome and take it away.
All right, thank you very much for that way over the top introduction. So we're going to talk about picking the right rocket. And what I'd like you to do throughout this is think of some use you can think of for space, something that you'd like to have, a satellite you'd like to put into orbit. Maybe you want a satellite that does nothing but watch your house and make sure you know what's going on there. Maybe you're a scientist or you're thinking about being a scientist and want to watch, I don't know, something involving our changing climate. Maybe you're going to be looking for changes in sea ice, the polar ice cap, something like that. We've got several missions that are doing that. We could absolutely use some more. So kind of have that in the back of your mind, what you would like to use space for. Maybe you want your own personal communication satellite up there, so you've always got music available to you that you can just connect with your site, whatever it is. We're going to talk today about some of the things that go through people's minds, go through the companies that are putting these satellites up there, the different parameters they have to think of when they're picking the right rocket. And I'll tell you where this presentation came from. I was down at the Kennedy Space Center a couple of years back for the launch of the Parker Space Probe, Parker Solar Probe, I should say. And it's a heliophysics mission. It's a mission that's out there studying the sun. It's out there right now doing some incredible things. It actually flies through the outer atmosphere of the sun, something we'd never done before. So it was a pretty challenging mission, and the parameters they had to think about to get it out there were very, very different from anything else that had been launched before, because we had literally never taken a spacecraft that close to the sun before. So I'm standing in the lobby of the administration building down at the Kennedy Space Center after a press conference, and I'm talking with one of the United Launch Alliance engineers. We'll see that name come up here a couple of times. ULA, we're going to talk about SpaceX, and we're going to talk about some other folks too. But I'm talking with this engineer about this, what we were going to see during the launch the next day, and helping me understand why we were going to see this particular rocket, this particular heavy lift rocket, especially since the the satellite that was being launched, the mission that was being launched, it's about the size of a washing machine. It was a relatively small spacecraft. It seemed like we were using really big iron there to launch something very, very small. And he gets out his notepad and starts scribbling things. A visual learner like me, he got to see things drawn out, and points out that the whole purpose of that rocket, the reason that rocket was the only one that could do the job, was that the big challenge there was changing velocity, delta V, we call it. We had to get the right delta V, not so much to speed the rocket up, but to slow it down. We had, or just to slow down the payload. We had to peel off some of that motion, some of that speed of the Earth going around the sun by going in the opposite direction of the way Earth was traveling. And literally, this particular rocket was the only one that could do the job. And about that time, a well-meaning person walked up, overheard our conversation, started grilling this poor engineer about, I don't understand why they didn't pick SpaceX for this. Now, SpaceX has done some incredible things and has really pushed us far, especially in terms of reuse of these rockets, but it's not always the right tool for the job. And at the end of this, after you've heard me ramble for 30, 40 minutes, I hope that's what you come away with this. Is the whole great big world out there. There's a lot of different choices, and there's not always one tool for the job. And that's true of engineering all the time. So let's jump into this. I can get my computer to cooperate with me. So first I want to talk about the different kinds of rockets. You may not realize this. You may not, when we think of rockets, what immediately pops into our mind is maybe the Saturn V back during the 60s and 70s. And certainly the space shuttle comes to mind. And today the SpaceX Falcon 9 comes to rocket. But there's a lot of different rockets that do different jobs. First one I want to point out are sounding rockets. And the next time you're in the museum, make sure that you go to the new wing of the museum, and I'll still call it the new wing. It's still new to all of us. Up on the and one of my museum friends here will keep me honest. I think it's up on the 3rd floor in the weather exhibit. There is a real sounding rocket hanging from the ceiling, and that was brought down from the Wallops Flight Facility up in Virginia, not too far away from us.
Second floor.
Thank you. I knew you'd keep me honest. I just walk until I see the rocket hanging from the ceiling. But that is a real sounding rocket that is used primarily for atmospheric research. So these are rockets that launch every couple of weeks from Wallops, and they're there to almost make it to space, but not quite. They need to get into the upper atmosphere. So these are suborbital, meaning they don't go into orbit. They don't go round and round the Earth. They go up and then go back down, primarily for atmospheric research. As you can see, there's a number of those to pick from here. That's probably not what what you're thinking of for your use of space. So the next one is going to be low Earth orbit and beyond. And you're going to see me use a lot of these 3-letter acronyms. The EO always means Earth orbit, and the L is where in that orbit we're going to get, mostly about how far away from the Earth we'll get. I'll dig into that a little bit, but this is just a sampling of some of the rockets that are out there. So some things that we're going to think about when we're trying to pick our rocket, what orbit we're going to. Super, super important. Not every rocket can make it to every orbit. Not every rocket is as good at some orbits than others, and we'll see that. Payload mass, that's probably the chief consideration there. How heavy, how big is the payload that you're trying to take to orbit? Is it the size of a washing machine, like the Parker Solar Probe? Is it closer to a refrigerator? Is it as big as a school bus? If it's as big as a school bus, you've got to get into some of the heavy lift rockets that you see down there at the bottom. And that Delta IV Heavy, the 3 orange rockets side by side, that's what was lifting the Parker Solar Probe. And if you notice just a little bit to the left, the Delta IV, that's what a heavy rocket is in a lot of cases. That's true of the Delta. That's also true of the Falcon Heavy, which isn't shown here. That's the Falcon 9. SpaceX Falcon 9, they're basically 3 of those smaller rockets bolted together to give that additional thrust, to give that additional delta V. And then on top of that is where you have that second stage. So payload dimensions, I kind of touched on that a little bit, how big the payload is. If it's a larger payload, it may not fit on top of one of these rockets. There's very specific sizes of what are called the payload fairings. If you see that blunt end, it looks like the top of a pen cap. That's the payload fairings. It's split in half. So, once the rocket gets to an altitude where there's very little air left, and there's not that air resistance, the payload fairings will split apart. They'll fall back to Earth, generally land in the ocean. Sometimes they burn up in the atmosphere. But there's certain sizes of payload fairings that will fit on top of there. So you may be, the booster part of the rocket may be perfectly sufficient for lifting that payload, but you might not be able to fit it in a payload frame. So that's another consideration. Orbit accuracy, I've got some slides on that as well that'll talk about that a little bit. Different payloads, different satellites have different tolerances for accuracy. You think about it in terms of, I don't know, maybe you're going out to buy pens and pencils. If you are buying a set of pencils or whatever for your kindergartner, you're going to have a certain set of things you're looking for there. Durability. It doesn't have to be that accurate. If you're buying pencils to do technical drawings, you probably want to have really, really fine tipped, accurate pencils. And you can think about what the cost difference on those two things are going to be. Some payloads, their orbit doesn't have to be that accurate. We're more looking for longevity. How long is that payload going to be able to stay up there? Others have to be super accurate. And I'll give you a very important example of an accurate payload where we needed really good accuracy and got it, that launched on Christmas morning. And that some of you may know what I'm talking about. We'll get there. And the last is cost. You lose some of those other things based on costs. The less expensive it is to launch a particular payload, you're probably not going to be able to launch as big a payload or as heavy of a payload, and you're really going to pay for it in terms of accuracy. But that may be okay, different tool for the job. So let me darken out a couple of these here. So this is what's left. After I get rid of some of those other rockets, this is all that is left today. These are the ones that are actively launching today of some of these low Earth orbit capable rockets. So that's the other thing to think about here is they come and go. There may be new ones that are introduced. In the past year or two, we've had several companies that have come online testing their rockets to be able to lift mostly commercial and communication satellites up there. And we'll see this list here continue to grow. But I'm going to focus on 3 rockets. I'm going to focus on the Ariane 5, which is put out by a company called Ariane Space. It's a French company that works with a lot of European partners. The Atlas 5, which is put out by a company called United Launch Alliance, which is a partnership between a couple of military contractor companies here in the US. It's been around for quite a long time. The Atlas is based on an ICBM. So it's based on a rocket that used to be used for war and is now absolutely used for peace. And then the Falcon 9 is SpaceX version of a rocket that can reach a couple of different kinds of orbits. And we've all heard of the Falcon 9, and it can do some amazing things. Notice that they're different sizes. That really doesn't matter here. They're achieving things differently. If you look at the bottom, each one of them, well, the two on the left-hand side, the Ariane and the Atlas, they have solid rocket motors on the side. They're achieving their orbits in different ways. Each one does have a liquid-fueled engine. Ariane has a single. The Atlas actually has a single with 2 nozzles. And then the Falcon 9, well, that's the way it was designed, is it has 9 engines. Just different approaches to the way the manufacturers do their thing. So let's jump into this. Before we do,
so Kim wants to know why it's called a Falcon. Is it just a cool name?
It's just a cool name. And my understanding is that you'll see a lot of sci-fi mentions in SpaceX naming. My understanding, it was at least inspired by the Millennium Falcon from Star Wars.
And that's what Jasper just said in the chat. Thanks,
Awesome.
Jasper. How many parsecs can it go?
I'll get into sometime my problem with that line on parsecs. He got it wrong as a unit, but that's for another conversation. So here's one of the most important things to consider when you're picking a rocket is where the heck you're going. So I'm going to dig in this to a little bit because it's good to know what's out there and what paths these these different rockets are taking. So this is, kind of the overview. You can see there's a couple of different places that things are put into orbit. There's 35,000 different objects that are being tracked by anything bigger than about 10 centimeters by initially the Air Force and now the Space Force. And there's a catalog of up to 50,000 objects, many of which have deorbited, and they're in these kind of orbits. So let's jump into it. Low Earth orbit is probably the one we think of the most. And here's some examples of things that are in low Earth orbit. The International Space Station is one of them. We can see the International Space Station. It's so big, it's about the size of a football field. We can see it as it passes over our homes. It's just a couple hundred miles up. Hubble Space Telescope. When we see these beautiful pictures that come back from the Hubble Space Telescope, it may seem like it's very, very far out in space, out beyond the moon or whatever. No, it's just a little bit beyond the space station. It's about 250 miles up. And it's in orbit. So that makes a really big challenge for getting those pictures because it's constantly moving. Each one of these low Earth orbits takes about 90 minutes for the object to make its way around the Earth. I'll give an example of Starlink. Those are a fleet, if you will, of about desk size, about office desk size satellites that are growing in number. There's several hundred. There will be several thousand up there eventually. Purpose being providing internet connectivity for just about all of the Earth. And then you need to have that many of them in order to provide that coverage. And I have to give Landsat as another example too. So the next time you're at the museum and you see the giant globe outside, those images on the side of the globe were provided by Landsat. Each one of these are going to be moving at the same speed, roughly 17,500 miles an hour. The lower that you are to Earth, in order to stay in orbit, the faster you have to go. So that's why it's a great place for some of these kind of purposes and not so great for others. If you want to go a little bit slower, if your need for being in space requires you to not move over the surface of the Earth quite so fast, you need to be in a different orbit. So there's a special kind of orbit called a polar low Earth orbit. So that white line that you see going around the Earth, closer to the equator, we're able to see only what we're able to see based on that orbit. If you're going into that more equatorial orbit, you'll never see the poles. You'll never see higher or lower than what that line is showing there. A polar orbit, where we go over the poles and let the Earth turn underneath of us, that allows us to see the absolutely all of the Earth at any point in time. So this is a great place to study the Earth. And when we think about NASA, we're thinking about space travel and all these robots that we have on Mars. We think about the astronauts. We think about the space station. But when you go out there and you count the satellites that NASA is working with, the missions that are currently active, the vast majority of them are looking back at Earth. And a lot of them are in polar orbit because they're there to study the Earth. So I give the NOAA POES mission. This is a climate studying mission, and the Suomi NPP, and this is a precipitation. I screw that word up every time. Precipitation monitor. This is studying the tops of clouds and helping us understand how storms form. And all that data comes back and helps us understand things like climate change, helps our meteorologists do better predictions and more accurate predictions. There is another special kind of low Earth orbit. It's actually a special kind of polar orbit called a sun synchronous one. It's canted just a little bit, but the purpose of this orbit is to put that satellite over a particular spot on the Earth at the same time each day. And that makes the sun angle the same each day. That allows us day to day to day to day to be able to accurately compare those pictures. That's good for missions that are looking for changes on the Earth's surface. Useful for understanding land use. There's a mission that looks at the color of the ocean to see how that color is changing. which might sound a little bit silly, but that tells us a lot about bacteria in the ocean and how plankton is forming and thriving. Very important kind of mission. And then GeoEye is a mission, again, that is looking at the Earth's surface. So the next one, going out a little bit and allowing us to go a little bit slower, is the medium Earth orbit. Now we're up to somewhere between 6,300 and over 12,000 miles in height. This is an orbit that we actually use anytime you pick up your phone and you use the mapping app on there, or anytime you pick up your phone. Just about so many of the apps are going to want to know where your location is. That's coming from the GPS satellites. Those are in medium Earth orbit. They are moving through the sky. Your phone can see as many as 5 of them at any point in time, and using that to fix your location on Earth. You might have noticed my clock behind me on the wall. That's actually coming from a GPS satellite. That's all the GPS satellites are really doing. They're broadcasting out a time signal and a code that tells you where the satellite is. And, the smarts inside your phone take all that information in and able to give not only a longitude and latitude of where you are on Earth, but actually how high up you are, and can be used to have a super accurate clock too. Compass and GLaSSNOS are more examples of navigational satellites. They're used to fix your position on Earth. It used to be something that was only available only about 20 years ago. Did we really start seeing this kind of consumer use of GPS? It's been around for a while. Part of that was mostly used by the military, but now it's used by everybody. Next, we move on to geosynchronous orbit. And geo meaning Earth, and synchronous meaning synchronized, tied together. Now you're moving at the speed that matches Earth. It matches the rotation of the Earth and allows you to park over a particular spot. You might recognize Dish Network as a communication. And DirecTV also uses a similar orbit. They're actually a little bit lower and do a little bit of orbiting over the equator. But here it's all about staying in one place and seeing one side of the Earth all the time. TDRS is the Tracking Data Relay Satellite, and that is NASA's network, Low Earth Network. It's how all of these satellites are able to communicate with each other, because if there's a satellite on the opposite side of the Earth, you can't see it line of sight. But we can kind of use the TDRS network, and there's a couple of them that are stationed around Earth in orbit that can communicate back and forth with each other. It's also how all of our communications with the International Space Station happen. It's how we can talk to astronauts on the ISS on the opposite side of the Earth here in the United States, either from obviously Mission Control in Houston. And there's actually quite a bit of it goes on in Huntsville, Alabama. That all goes up through the TDRS network. So the geostationary is kind of a special version of the geosynchronous orbit. That's all about being parked over the equator. Some of my favorite ones are here. GOES is the weather satellites that we see every day when we tune into the news and we see the weather satellite images. That's coming from GOES. There's always going to be 2. They're run by NOAA, and there's one on the East Coast and there's one on the West Coast. There's a GOES satellite launch coming up here in just a couple of weeks. GOES West, that's parked out over the Pacific Ocean, is going to be replaced by a brand new one. There's a problem with some of the cooling systems in the existing one, so it needs to be replaced. These are very, very important because they give us additional warning for things like hurricanes. They allow us to watch on the East Coast, that Atlantic basin where the hurricanes form and move. So those are critical. Another example is John Deere's Starfire. They're actually renting time on a geostationary satellite that's parked over the United States. You may see some farm equipment with little kind of nubs on top of the tractors. It's talking to the John Deere Starfire program that allows them to do automated farming, they call it. It gives them the ability to make the most use of the fields. They're tracking within the fields down to just incredible amounts of distance, down to just a couple of feet. So they apply seed, they apply fertilizer, things like that in the most efficient way. It's all being done using data that's coming from space. So that's another usage. And the final one is going to be this highly elliptical one. And there's a couple of examples here. SiriusXM uses this so that they can get as close as possible to the Earth without and still be moving fairly slow. And they have a couple of satellites that are rotating through this. The one over on the left-hand side, my Russian's not good enough to try and pronounce this, but that's kind of the grandfather of this orbit. It was something that was developed by the Russians to be able to have really good, deep understanding of some small spaces on Earth. And in order to do that, they needed to get pretty close. They wanted to go a little bit slower, so they're using this highly elliptical. And elliptical means that it's not a perfect circle. It's something that's more highly elliptical. It's going to be stretched out a little bit. And a quick story on a highly elliptical orbit that's just been in the news this week. We've learned that a SpaceX rocket, the upper stage of the SpaceX rocket, you've got the two different stages there, the booster that we see return back to Earth and land very spectacularly. That landed just fine, but every time SpaceX launches something, it leaves that second stage in orbit. Well, one of those second stages that's in a highly elliptical orbit is expected to impact the moon here on March 4th. And that happens when you are in an orbit around the moon. It happens eventually, but the way we measure orbits, we call it the eccentricity of the orbit. If it's a perfect circle, there's a couple out there that do manage to make a perfect circle, which is pretty incredible because the Earth itself is not spherical. It's kind of smushed a little bit. If it's a perfect circle, that has an eccentricity of 0. And if it is a straight line, meaning we collapse that circle down so it's completely flat, that's an eccentricity of 1. It doesn't exist as an orbit because it's a line. But this particular rocket I'm talking about, the upper stage of the SpaceX rocket, has an eccentricity of 0.89, which is a lot. It's really, really stretched out. It is so stretched out, it makes an orbit every 6 months. That's how stretched out it is. So let's jump into some more things that are.
Before we jump in, I have a couple of questions.
Please do.
So folks are wondering. I think that I was wondering this in the practice session about the John Deere satellite. So folks are wondering why it's named John Deere, and I remember it's because John Deere put it up, right?
Yeah, there it is actually the John Deere company. Out of Moline, Illinois, I think it is, and we have one of their facilities in Cary. Does some R&D there. I don't know if the equipment that's put out in Cary will have this kind of satellite technology on it, because I think it's more about golf courses and lawn care and things like that. But the big tractors that are used for farming will have these little satellite receivers on top of them. John Deere does not own the satellite. It is rented out time, owned by somebody else. But that whole communications path and all the data that's being shared there, that's actually absolutely a product of the John Deere company. Pretty cool, huh?
That is very cool. And
space is used for a lot of other things than just the kind of scientific things that might jump to your head.
Isn't it so? It's so fascinating, I think, to have a talk like this, because so much of us are focused on space exploration and we don't realize how much space is used for Earth purposes. So Ryan from Idaho wants to know if they still use hydrogen as rocket fuel.
You're always going to have a fuel and an oxidizer. So hydrogen can be a part of that. There's lots of different ways of achieving that fuel and oxygen mix. So yeah, hydrogen is definitely a part of that. Any others? I'm sure we'll have some more going forward. So the last orbit I want to talk about is an injection orbit. This is an orbit that you're simply putting up there long enough to get stable before you leave to go somewhere else. I mentioned the Parker Solar Probe a couple of times. The Apollo missions were using what's called a translunar injection orbit, where we're going to the moon. I wanted to throw a Mars mission in there as an example. That's a trans-Mars injection orbit. Hopefully we'll be hearing more about that as we continue to study Mars, eventually get people there. The James Webb Space Telescope, that's the one that launched on Christmas morning. It was going out to L2. It was going out to a point about 1 million miles away from Earth that is a point of balance that allows us to kind of hang out there, put the spacecrafts back to Earth to block the sun and to block the Earth so the Webb telescope can operate in that cold, dark environment that it needs. The mission that I mentioned, the SpaceX upper stage that's going to impact the moon, it was lifting a mission for NOAA that's studying space weather that is out at L1, which is 1 million miles away from Earth, but between Earth and the sun. Great place to sit and monitor the solar weather, particularly the solar wind, looking for geomagnetic storms before they hit the Earth. So that's the last one of those. And now we're going to jump into those 3 rockets that I mentioned before. So payload capacity, definitely a consideration. And I'll say all these numbers I'm going to share with you here. I've got the sources down at the bottom. Take these with a grain of salt. They're just there for comparison purposes. And in a lot of cases, I'm comparing apples with oranges, but it's just to give you kind of a feeling of how these comparisons go. There is not one Ariane 5 ECA. There's not one Atlas 551. There's not one Falcon 9. They can be configured differently. They can have different options to achieve whatever they want to achieve. But just for basic comparison purposes, let's look at this using some of these numbers. So low Earth orbit and geotransfer orbit are the 2 orbits that we're looking at. We've just seen the different places that you can go. Some of these rockets, they're built for one particular kind of orbit. The Ariane 5 doesn't really put that much into low Earth orbit. It's not what it was designed to do. It's really good at putting stuff in geotransfer orbit. So I don't even list that one there. The Atlas 5, it's better at putting stuff into low Earth orbit than it is, putting it into geotransfer orbit than it is putting stuff into low Earth orbit. So you'll see this is the rocket that's selected a lot by NASA when we want to go to places like Mars, or we want to go to any of the other planets. I've personally seen the Atlas 5 launch 3 or 4 times, but it's because I've been down there for NASA missions that are, they're planetary missions. They're going to study things outside of low Earth orbit. We hear a lot about the Falcon 9. It's really good at putting stuff into low Earth orbit. And it's got a pretty good payload capacity too. We can put up to 22 metric tons up there, which is absolutely great. So you see it kind of wins the battle there. But then when we move over to geotransfer orbit, we want to put something outside of the Earth. You're going to go to the Ariane 5. It was built to lift heavier payloads and take them to a point where it can get outside of Earth's gravity and can get moving on to whatever position it wants to. The Ariane 5 is what was used to launch the James Webb Space Telescope back on Christmas morning. It was going to L2. It wasn't going to low Earth orbit. You think back to the Hubble Space Telescope, and it was launched, it was launched by the Space Shuttle and serviced by the Space Shuttle, and it was actually sized to fit in the Space Shuttle's cargo bay, but it's in low Earth orbit. So totally different place to go. So different set of parameters. This just kind of gives you an idea of right tool for the job, and not every rocket is going to be good at everything. So the next thing to think about, and this gets debated online quite a bit, what's the best rocket? I personally think the question, what's the best rocket, is silly for some of the reasons that we're talking about here, because the next question needs to be, well, what are you trying to do with the rocket? But we also think about the success record. And you can look at the pure success failure rate, and the Atlas 5 is winning that. They will say that they have a perfect success rate. And maybe that's not quite true, because there was one launch many, many years ago that, back in 2002, that had a partial success. So a bit about success failure. If the rocket blows up on the pad, if the rocket blows up on ascent, clearly that's a failure. But the rocket can make it to orbit and still be considered a failure if it does not put the payload into the right orbit. It doesn't put it into the place where the customer that's buying that ride to space can't do the job that they intended on doing with that payload, then that's a failure. That being said, there can be partial failures. That's what happened here, and it's happened, basically to everybody. And that's that. There's a list of things that define success for that particular payload, and that's called the primary mission. If you can only achieve a couple of those, That's a partial success. It really shouldn't be considered failure, but you got to be able to achieve all of those to consider it a success. So this is something that's looked at, is how successful is it? We look at how long it's been around, and that's what that final column there is, years in operation. We also look at that particular rocket, how successful has that version of the rocket been, and how long has it been around? SpaceX has not been around a long time. They've launched a lot of rockets. They had some really good success, but they've also not been around a super long time. So that will give some pause. So thinking back to what I challenged you with, thinking about that use case, that thing that you want to do in space, is it a payload that's common? Is it a satellite that's very, very common? You know, if there's a problem, could you build another one really quickly? Or is it really unique? An example of a unique one would be the James Webb Space Telescope. There was one of those built. There really weren't many engineering models, engineering mock-ups or anything. A couple of some of the subsystems were developed that way for testing purposes, but there was one James Webb Space Telescope built. So the risk had to be considered there. We needed a rocket that had a really good success rate, because it just really wasn't worth it to do something a little bit cheaper in order to save some money in launching it, because if you lost that payload, building another one was going to be really, really expensive and take a really long time. So we think about some of those kind of things. Next, we think about accuracy. And this is something you might not think about. You know, we see these incredible rockets on ascent, and they put their payloads in the right place, but it's not right or wrong. There's a range of good. There's a word that you'll hear if you ever watch launches on NASA TV or on YouTube or wherever. You hear them talk about nominal, and nominal is not a binary thing. It's not good, it's bad, it's nominal. There's a range of good there. There is exactly in the middle of that range, and that's what everybody's shooting for. That's what we're trying to hit. But you can vary a little bit, and that variance is defined by the payload, you know, what our tolerance there is. So these are bullseyes that are produced after every launch by the United Launch Alliance. They're companies, so they're trying to advertise their accuracy here. But as you can see, their accuracy is pretty good. And if you look through several of these, it tends to be pretty good. But something else to notice when you're looking at these charts here, notice that each one of them kind of has a different measure. There's different things about the orbit that need to be right. Apogee and perigee, I'll define those in a moment. Inclination is how tilted that orbit is. I talked a little bit about eccentricity, how circular the orbit is. You can see for different missions that matters a little bit differently. So here's where we get into some orbital dynamics. And I promise I'll be gentle here. There's only 3 items here that I want to really point out. But this is kind of a classical diagram showing the different parts of an orbit that we measure. And this is what the Space Force does for us every day, monitoring all those things that are orbiting Earth. The kind of gray disk that you see there, that's the equator. And then the orange disk that's slicing through it, that's the orbit of, you know, whatever satellite we're talking about here. The 3 parameters that we're going to look at when we're talking about accuracy are apogee, perigee, and inclination. So apogee and perigee are measuring how far out that orbit goes from Earth. Easy way to remember it, apogee is bigger, perigee is smaller. Perigee is the closer part, apogee is the farther away part. The easy way to remember it is apogee begins with A, or away. I have to think about this every time I look at it. So I like those kind of mnemonics to help me. So we're going to look at apogee and perigee and inclination. So inclination is in degrees how tilted that orbit is. So an inclination of 0 is orbiting the equator exactly. An inclination of 90 is exactly orbiting the poles. So you'll see somewhere between there. The neat thing about the inclination too is you look at the inclination and you can immediately tell what that satellite is going to cover. So if you have an inclination of 0, all it's ever going to see is the equator. If you have an inclination anywhere bigger than that, you take that and you apply it to latitude. Longitude goes this way on the Earth, latitude goes this way. You apply that to latitude, and that tells you how high in northern latitude and how low in southern latitude that satellite is ever going to see. So that's why inclination is super important. If you miss that inclination, you put it in a lower one, there's going to be parts of the Earth that you can't see. That's really important when you're trying to put a satellite up there that's going to be looking at the Earth for whatever purposes. The ISS is in a 53.6, I think it is, degree inclination, and that was picked so it could see the parts of the Earth they wanted to see, but also so it overflies all of the facilities in Russia that are helping us manage the International Space Station. The Russians are big partners with the International Space Station. So let's look at the numbers. And again, apples and oranges.
Do we have time for a couple questions?
Oh, absolutely.
All right. So Glenn wants to know, what happens to the old GOES satellites?
So they are placed in a parking orbit, which means we kind of move them aside for a period of time because they're still useful. The older ones, they have some older technology on them. But if there's ever a problem with the active GOES satellite, we can move it aside and bring that older one up as kind of a backup. Now, everything has a lifespan on it, so there will be eventually deorbited. We'll use whatever fuel is left over on it, slow it down. Really, all it takes to deorbit anything is to slow down. You let Earth's gravity take over and pull it in. So those really old ones, we'll slow them down, we'll deorbit them, timing it just perfectly so that it will fall into a place, a really big expanse of the South Pacific. We call this satellite graveyard.
Yeah. And is it recovered or at that point?
Most of it burns up in the atmosphere. And that's something as we build satellites now, there's really a push to build it for destruction, to build it
like
in
compostable.
A way. It's a compostable satellite, sure. Most of it turns into just basically vaporized as it moves through the upper parts of the atmosphere at these incredible, if you're coming through the atmosphere at 17,000 miles an hour, you're going to break up pretty well. There's a couple of chunks, bigger chunks that are left behind, but again, that all ends up at the bottom of the Pacific.
Okay. And Pokemon is asking about James Webb Space Telescope they're asking if it's a satellite.
It is technically a satellite, absolutely. Yeah, and it is actually in orbit, believe it or not. So we place it out at the L2 position at the Lagrange point 2, about 1 million miles from Earth. And it is in a slow orbit around there. And its orbit is actually really interesting. We put it out there because it's a point of balance. And that allows us to use very little fuel to stay kind of in one place. And the less fuel we use, the longer we can make the mission. And the longer we can make the mission, the more use we can get out of the satellites. That's a really good thing. In the last couple of weeks, you've been hearing about Webb getting to that L2 point. And it doesn't just stop there. It actually can't stop. All its engines are facing back towards Earth. So it's not like we can fire them in the opposite direction and come to a complete stop. We've been coasting uphill as we get farther and farther away from Earth's gravity to go into that slow L2 orbit. Picture the orbit of the moon around the Earth. Double that. That's about how big that orbit turned on this side is around that L2 point. So it is definitely a satellite, but now it is a satellite of the sun, not of the Earth, because it is orbiting around the sun.
Very cool. And if you want to learn more about James Webb, we have one of the project scientists will be speaking tomorrow. So maybe Cindy can drop that link in the chat. So Kim wants to know, are there any rockets in space right now?
There are a ton of rockets in space. Rockets are very useful to get us off the Earth's surface and get us up into orbit, but they become space junk once they're up there. Like I mentioned, SpaceX is able to land their boosters, but still there's parts of every launch that end up in space. We've learned a lot about that, and we want to prevent space junk from causing problems in the future. So we try to design these missions in a way that they will deorbit sooner rather than later. Like I mentioned before, the most of the whatever is deorbiting, especially an empty cylinder that is the rocket at that point, all its fuel is spent. It's pretty good about burning up in the atmosphere. But some of these orbits will take it into a place where we have to leave some rocket bodies behind. You go on, there's a couple of databases that are managed by the Air Force. You can go and look at what's up there right now. And a very large part of it, a very large portion of it, the names of these items will have R/B next to it. And that means rocket body. That means space junk, really big space junk. You can see this space junk go over. Not only the International Space Station, we can see some of these scientific satellites go over, but when I'm outside with my telescope looking up at night, I see at least 4, 5, 6 rocket bodies go over. There's a bunch of them up there. That's a good question.
It is a good question. So Daniel is asking, is there a function that describes the path of a rocket?
And that's what you got on the screen here. It's complicated. It has lots of components to it. I haven't even shown all of them here. There is a piece of data that is accessible on the web, provided by the Air Force, that if you have one of those apps on your phone that tells you when the space station or any other satellite goes over, it's using that data. And there's about 13 or 14 different numbers that are used to describe that orbit, because you're describing something in 3 dimensions, but you're not only doing that, you're describing how it changes, because that data comes out a couple of times a week, and it is used by those formulas to determine not only where that satellite is right now, but where it'll be in a couple of days at a particular point in time. So on those apps, people often ask me what's the best app I can download to be able to know when the space station is coming over. And my answer is download a couple and find the one that looks the best to you. The question of what's the most accurate, they're all pulling from the same data, 100%. So whatever looks the best, great, go with that. Because accuracy wise, they should all be the same.
And in Marcel, as you were saying that, was asking, what's your favorite app?
My favorite app is your favorite app.
That, like, at the same time it was being asked. So one last question and we can move on. Kim wants to know, are there any rockets with astronauts in space right now?
There are, I believe the number is 6. Somebody Google for me. Somebody go on and Google and put it in the chat. How many people are in space right now? There's a website that tracks this. It'll just come up with a big integer. I think the number is 6 right now. It's hard to keep up with because we're going back and forth to space station all the time. There are 6 people aboard the International Space Station, and I believe there's a full crew. 10. Yeah, so there's another 4 aboard the Chinese space station. We often forget them because we don't hear as much about them, but China has their own space station up right now as well. So I love that website, and it changes literally after every launch. Within minutes of a launch, you'll see that update, and you can kind of click through and see some information about each one of those astronauts.
Yeah, so it says there's 4 NASA astronauts. I'm not really sure exactly how. Oh, that's how they went up. Okay, so 5 NASA astronauts, but 1 went up on a Soyuz, and then 2 Russian cosmonauts, and then 3 on the Tianhe space station.
I'm gonna let you pronounce that, not me.
I did my best. I apologize if that was.
I think that sounded right. Other questions?
Oh, that's it for right now.
We'll have some time for others as well. So, all right, let's get our math on. I promise to keep it gentle. So here are those numbers. These are really comparing apples to oranges because I pulled these from, you can go and download the PDF documents that each one of these manufacturers puts out there for the people that are really going out and spending millions buying these launch services. And they tell everything you'd ever want to know about the rocket. And you'll see a lot of things in there about how you can bolt on your payload to make sure your payload's going to fit in there, the exact dimensions of how that works. The Falcon 9 in particular, I'm using really old data because for whatever reason, SpaceX stopped publishing that a couple of years ago. The exact specifics of what their orbit accuracy, how accurately they can place your object into orbit. So that's old data. I reached out to SpaceX, didn't hear back from them. I was looking for updated information, but here we are. The whole reason I'm throwing this up here is to show you that for this particular orbit, and I picked a GTO orbit. I picked an orbit like the one that was needed for the the James Webb Space Telescope, just for comparison purposes. So this helps answer the question of why they picked the Ariane 5 to lift James Webb. The other answer for why they picked the Ariane 5 to lift James Webb was James Webb certainly was built under NASA supervision. It was a partnership between the Canadian Space Agency and the European Space Agency. Everybody contributed something there. But one of the big contributions from the European Space Agency was the launch services, was this Ariane 5 rocket. So this is the advertised accuracy. I haven't seen the exact numbers yet, but my understanding is they got way better than this. And what that means is because they were able to so accurately place it in orbit, that initial figure of how long we expected the Webb telescope to last was 5 years. That is the primary mission. That is the amount of time that is budgeted for running the mission. That is the amount of time that is needed to accomplish those initial set of goals. They put enough fuel on board that within these parameters right here, they should be able to get 10 years out of it. Every little bit of fuel that we have to use in order to put that rocket into the right position is going to reduce the lifespan of that mission, because we can't use that fuel to keep it into that orbit around L2. So you can see from, I've colored them green, yellow and red. It was the right choice for that particular mission. The Falcon couldn't have done it. Could it have physically lifted the vehicle? Maybe. I'd have to look at the payload specifications. I'd have to look at if there's a payload fairing we could fit it in. I don't think there's one big enough for it. It's a big payload. The telescope itself folds out to the size of a tennis court. But for this particular mission, the Ariane 5 was absolutely the right thing to do. We not only were able to get that 10 years out of it, word coming back after they've studied the orbit that ended up in after launch tells us that they're going to get 20 years out of it, which is super exciting. And we're now even talking about being able to send missions out there, not so much to refuel it, but to be able to attach a small satellite, really, with engines on it, with thrusters that can keep it in that orbit even after it runs out of fuel for a longer period of time. So we might get even more time out of the Webb telescope. Maybe it'll last as long as Hubble has. It passed 25 years itself very recently. So other questions about any of this?
Yeah. So Kim was asking, are there any scientists in space? And I think that's a pretty cool thing to talk about.
It is. And if you look back at the history of the space program, when we first started hiring astronauts, when those first group of astronauts were selected, they were all test pilots. And that was absolutely the right thing to choose for the kind of person that you wanted in your spacecraft, because they're all very experimental. And these people were really good at taking out new vehicles and figuring out how to ensure that they could get the job done and that it was going to be safe. So right people for the job there. Over the years, the faces of the people within the astronaut corps have changed. And the answer now is they're all scientists. That's who we put up there. We put up medical doctors. We put up geologists sometimes. We botanists now. They're growing things on the space station. So the people that are selected as astronauts now, they're all scientists. Those are the kind of people that go to space.
And they're also sent. So they're not necessarily only doing their own experiments, right? Aren't they sent to do like other experiments as well?
100%. And they have to be trained in some of these other sciences that they're maybe not as familiar with. And I like to kid the museum staff. So many of you are so much more versed in biology than I am. I just love listening to you talk about some of these things. So a lot of what they have to do up there is biology. They may be chemists that are doing their thing. so all this is trained for, and it is something that
Did we lose?
He's lost.
Okay, we lost Tony. Okay, well, I was so I'm sure he'll come right back. I'm always worried that it's me, my computer, that's messing up when these things happen. So while he's rejoining, I'm gonna put a link to Supercluster in the chat, because this is one of my favorite websites. This has shown every living thing, sorry, Cindy, not plants, that's gone up to space. So all the animals and fungus. So sorry, Tony, I was putting in a link to Supercluster while you were rejoining.
Awesome. Sorry about that. Had a little
That's all right.
Internet glitch.
It happens to the best of us.
So yeah, and we know of Houston as a place where all of the things that have to do with human spaceflight go on. But what you may not know is in Huntsville, Alabama, they actually talk to the astronauts aboard the space station a lot more. Tons of scientists down there that are helping guide some of these missions or some of these experiments. To your point, not every astronaut is going to be as versed in all the different sciences. So they got people that are helping them through. Their days are spent, about half of it is doing science, and it's science for other people. And about half of it is taking care of themselves, exercising, taking care of the space station, things like that. So we need scientists up there, definitely. Other
Absolutely.
questions?
So let me check YouTube really quickly. But yeah, I think those are the questions we have for now. Do we, folks have more questions? Put them in the chat.
And while they're doing that, I'll give myself a little plug. So if this kind of stuff you find interesting, about once a week, sometimes more often than that, if there's something cool going on, I write for WRAL TV here in Raleigh, North Carolina. So if you go to WRAL.com and you type in weather blog, I pop something up there, like I say, about once a week with something interesting. That information that I just shared about the SpaceX upper stage hitting the moon, posted that yesterday. And it's got some good information about when that's going to happen, why it's going to happen, and why it's not really that big of a deal. I like to post those from time to time. Some of the reporting out there is maybe a little more alarmist than it needs to be. So try to throw a few things out there, letting you know really what's happening, what you should care about, and what isn't that big of a deal. I'll also have something up there about that James Webb Space Telescope orbit and why that's kind of cool.
Very cool. Well, Tony, thank you so much. Oh, Kim wants to know, well, this will be our last question because we're almost out of time, but how many satellites are in space?
Ooh, so active ones, I don't know the number off the top of my head. It is absolutely tens of thousands that are up there. And once you start counting in space junk as well, which would be inactive satellites, things that used to be useful, but ran out of fuel or whatever, and you count all those bits of debris and things like that. And sometimes we do some experiments where we turn big pieces of debris into tens of thousands of pieces of debris. That happened with a missile test or anti-satellite test here a couple of months ago. That number increases. So there's absolutely tens of thousands of things up there.
Wow, that is a lot of space junk. All right. Well, Tony, thank you so much. It has been such a pleasure having you and learning about such cool stuff. So thank you for that. And thank you guys for joining us today. If you want to commemorate Astronomy Days, we have super cool Venus t-shirts and hoodies available at our museum store. So check them out. I want to say thank you to our sponsors, North Carolina Space Grant and Pepsi. And I also want to thank our members. If you are a member, thank you so much. Your membership helps us put on programs like Astronomy Days. And if you're not a member, please consider joining so that you can support the awesome things the museum is doing. With that, we have another talk It's going to be at noon about Lucy looking for fossils in the solar system. So that is really cool. And we have, again, we have all day programs today, tomorrow, and Sunday. So 3 more really full days of astronomy days. So I will see you at the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.